At this time, I would like to introduce our host, Maria Shumar. Maria is a specialist in the area of elder abuse prevention. She was a victim witness program specialist for 22 years, serving in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Attorney's Office, where she worked on domestic violence and all types of elder abuse cases, along with extensive work in community outreach. She was also employed at the Abused Persons Program in Montgomery County, Maryland, where she served as a domestic violence shelter advocate. She currently serves as a board member of Elder Safe, a shelter for abused seniors in Rockville, Maryland. She also is a volunteer domestic violence prevention trainer for Catholic Charities in Washington, D.C. In 2015, she was detailed to the White House Conference on Aging, where she began work with the DOJ Elder Justice Initiative. She retired from her position as Victim Witness Program Specialist at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office in 2015 and is now a consultant in the area of elder abuse and victim advocacy for the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, John. And hello and welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm your host, Maria Shumar, and I would like to talk to you a little bit about the Elder Justice Initiative. Our mission is to support and coordinate the Department of Justice's enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse, neglect, and financial fraud and scams that target older adults. And we do this by promoting justice for older adults, helping older victims and their families, enhancing state and local efforts through training and resources, and supporting research to improve elder abuse policy and practice. We have a number of different products on elderjustice.gov. We have outreach material, our MTDT guide and toolkit, prosecutor video series, financial exploitation and reporting pages, elder abuse research, webinars, elder abuse statutes, and much, much more. These are just a few of our products. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sheri Gibson, who we are so fortunate to have today as our speaker. Dr. Gibson received her PhD in clinical psychology with an emphasis in geropsychology from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She is an instructor and clinical supervisor for the psychology department at UCCS and a faculty affiliate with the UCCS Gerontology Center. Dr. Gibson serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, is a member of the research committee for the National Adult Protective Services Association, and a member of Pikes Peak Elder Abuse Coalition. In addition to being an advocate for elder justice, Dr. Gibson has a private psychotherapy and consultation practice, which includes provision of capacity evaluations, expert testimony, consultation, and training. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Gibson.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to all of the supportive staff and people at the Elder Abuse Initiative. It's such a pleasure being here with you today, and I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so I'm hopeful that all of you can see my screen, and Maria, if you could just chime in and let me know if you cannot see. Okay, thank you. John, just let me know. All right. Thank you so much. Now that we've gone through the technology piece, in this new world of webinar trainings, this is always something that we're having to contend with. So thank you, everybody, for being here. It's just such a pleasure, again, to be presenting on a topic that is really something that I'm passionate about, and hope that those of you who are viewing it today either will come into this topic with your own experience, or maybe you are completely new to the concept of trauma-informed care or counseling for older adults, and what does that look like? So I'm going to just really launch in because we don't have a whole lot of time, and I am a psychologist after all, and one of my friends told me once that I could talk to a door jamb for about 3 hours, and he was pretty much right. So I really want to cover a lot of information here and leave a little bit of room at the end for Q&A. So today, what I'd like to do is really kind of put together for you a backdrop of what are some of the specific challenges that are faced in later life, and using a biopsychosocial model that requires us to look at a person holistically, and also does require that we understand how we can work as partners in a community to best serve older adults. I also want to talk about the cumulative impact that trauma can have on adult development and coping strategies, understanding what those network of aging services are in various communities, whether you're in a rural community or a larger community, so that older adults can have access to those resources. Also learning about how do we build rapport with people that can help facilitate mental health treatment and engagement in services, because the rapport building piece, the relational aspect of what we do, is really the most critical piece. And then understanding the ethical tensions of those principles of autonomy and beneficence, which often do come up in cases where we're assessing risk. And for those of you, because we are talking about elder abuse, you might be frontline responders, first responders to elder abuse. You might be in social services. You could be in medical field or financial disciplines. And so understanding what confidentiality means, and how do we understand dignity of risk in decision making with older adults. So I want to first say that older adults, just like anybody throughout the lifespan, will come into older age struggling with problems that threaten one's psychological stability. And at any point in the lifespan, people may be managing chronic illness, disability, death-related loss, or prolonged caregiving for family members with severe cognitive or physical impairments. And these problems are not unique to late life, but are more likely in the latter third of life. And additionally, late life is not immune to the usual vicissitudes of all of life that all of us experience: disappointment in love, family arguments, failing at the goals or the tasks that we set aside for ourselves. And so, like most people, many people come into late life who have struggled with depression or anxiety, maybe even serious mental illness throughout their lifetime. And as they age, those problems then follow them into later life. It's important that we debunk a few myths about aging that does have negative impact on older adults. It's not uncommon that we implicitly assume that problems that are faced by adults are due to advanced age rather than an underlying illness or a psychological disorder or severe life stress. I've added here a quotation that was actually taken from a client of mine years ago that I saw, and she said, "I feel unheard and hopeless when my physician says it's common for someone of your age to experience depression and hearing loss." So you can understand that there's this tendency, I guess, for people and medical providers, other providers, to equate the old years. And when I say old, I'm talking about 85 plus, old years with illness and frailty and disability. And there's also an equation or another type of myth that happens where we equate the young old. And when I say young old, I'm talking about age 65 to 74, that we equate the young old with a more healthy, leisure-oriented, post-retirement type of lifestyle. What we know, though, is that the actual shift from a healthy, active years of aging to physical or mental frailty is due to specific disease processes, which differ across individuals and in the onset, the age of onset. And so those individual variations, which are common, can lead to observations that maybe somebody who is in his or her 80s seem to be very young for their age, whereas someone in his or her 60s could seem maybe quite old. And so there's a tendency to equate those two. The reality involves some association between aging and frailty, but that association is far from a one-to-one correspondence. The belief that aging and frailty are identical causes can cause problems for many older adults. So, for example, providers tend to focus on the loss and deficits and pathology rather than understanding a specific challenge that's related to a phase of life that can be assessed very simply, easily, and treated with a focus. In geropsychology, which is the area of psychology that I work, we really refer to a biopsychosocial model of health that views health and illness as a result of not only from the biological and physical factors, but also cumulative effects of a lifetime of psychological, social, and behavioral processes. And I've listed them here under each domain. When we use a biopsychosocial approach in seeing the whole person, we can understand factors that lead to successful aging, or what we would call maybe positive aging, but we can also view those factors in terms of a person's vulnerabilities or risks, or maybe areas in which we can intervene and be successful in intervention. I would also add here that there's another layer. I usually refer to the biopsychosocial model, adding to that the biopsychosocial spiritual model, because spirituality is another area around which we need to investigate, we need to analyze, ask about, and we know that it is an area of great support for older adults, also an area that can inform us how people view illness, what they're willing to do around their medical care, that is guided and informed by their spiritual practice. So, for example, the influence of diet and exercise can be analyzed to understand its effects on physical and mental well-being. Psychological influence, including depression, one's mindset, self-esteem, mental stimulation, those can all be evaluated into their respective roles in the aging process. We also understand that cultural beliefs and social engagements will be considered important contributors for emotional well-being. Due to the great intricacies of aging, it's imperative that physical, psychological, and social influences be taken into consideration as catalysts for healthy aging, and also informs us of where we can intervene with people. So I want to put a little bit of meat on the skeleton, if you will, and I want to share a story of Mrs. Martinez. We're going to come back to her later in the presentation as well. And I know that all of you can read, but I'll go ahead and read it for us as well, just in case you're having me in the background and you're doing your dishes. So Mrs. Martinez is an 83-year-old Hispanic woman whose husband died from a sudden heart attack 1 year ago. She has an 8th grade education and raised 4 children with her husband. Since her husband's death, her youngest son was released from jail after serving 2 years for a domestic violence offense, and has moved in with her to get back on his feet. Ms. Martinez lives in a fixed income of $860 per month. She owns her own home. She manages her type 2 diabetes and was recently diagnosed with macular degeneration, which resulted in her decision to cease driving. She and her son made an informal agreement that she would provide him with a place to live if he would drive her to her doctor's appointments, the store, and to church. Adult Protective Services were called by her primary care provider, who reported that she had not attended the last 2 doctor's visits and was worried about her diabetes management. APS later learned that Mrs. Martinez took a taxi to the emergency department because she had run out of her insulin and her son had not been home in 5 days. Most of you can probably identify with Mrs. Martinez as somebody that you've known, that you've worked with, that you've intervened with. So when we look at Mrs. Martinez's story through that biopsychosocial model, here are the things that come up. Biologically, we look at her medical comorbidities such as type 2 diabetes and macular degeneration, two very important diagnoses that she is managing. Psychologically, we look at a recent life transition, that is the adjustment to widowhood and the recent move-in of her son. We don't know much about the son's own mental health or his own stability, only the piece that he's been incarcerated for a history of domestic violence. And socially, we know about Mrs. Martinez that she has increased dependence on her son for transportation due to her ceasing her driving. She also values social engagement as she does attend church, and she may have limited access to her care and to going to those social activities because she depends fully on her son to provide those resources for her. When we think about Mrs. Martinez or any of the clients with whom we're working, we also want to be mindful of the potential for trauma. And so we have to start with, what is trauma? What is the definition of trauma? And this definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The definition itself reads, individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Trauma, it's important here that the framework that we're using here is helpful in understanding the complex nature of trauma. And so the focus on events, I have events highlighted here. The focus on events places the cause of trauma in the environment, not in some defect in the individual. And this is what underlies the basic credo of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approaches. It's not what is wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. Also, experience that is highlighted here highlights the fact that not every child or adult will experience the same event as traumatic. And then finally, the identification of a broad range of potential effects, which I've highlighted, reminds us that our response must be holistic. It's not enough to focus on symptoms or behaviors. Our goal is to support an individual to living a most satisfying life as possible. There's a wide range of events that can potentially cause trauma. Trauma can be caused by events that the individual doesn't remember, such as events that occurred in early childhood. Trauma can be caused by events that are well-intentioned and necessary, such as a medical treatment or medical procedure. Trauma can also be caused by an event that didn't happen to a person, but to a group of people or a community that he or she closely identifies with, such as in slavery, the Holocaust, or the genocide of the Native American people. And over time, chronic stressors such as poverty can accumulate to cause trauma. I think looking back on the last 2 years, we could also add to this list a global pandemic, the chronic stress of being quarantined for a long period of time, which unfortunately many older adults have experienced. So you could probably look at all of these different categories and the different types of trauma that can occur, and recognize people that you may have served who may have experienced multiple types of trauma throughout their lives. The prevalence of trauma is important to note here. The exposure to trauma is ubiquitous. Some studies earlier in 2015 found that 7 out of 10 respondents worldwide and 9 out of 10 adults in the US reported experiencing one or more lifetime traumas. The majority of persons exposed to trauma endure typically mild to moderate psychological distress, followed by a return to what we would call pre-trauma health shortly after. But nevertheless, a substantial proportion of persons exposed to traumatic events do develop chronic pathological symptoms that could be debilitating and last even several years. So it's important to know that trauma can also be cumulative. Many of you are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response that's typically used to describe how the brain signals our bodies to get out of a dangerous situation when the brain perceives a threat or a dangerous situation. And the flight, fight, or freeze responses have also been used to describe some common behaviors of trauma survivors, behaviors that are often labeled as problems by the mental health system even, but can be linked to these responses and the effects that trauma can have on the brain. So for example, in this slide, I've listed these sets of problems, if you will, that have often been attributed to people in the mental health system, shows how behavior may be actually viewed as a survival mechanism tied to that fight, flight, or freeze response. So the first is the fight response. Someone who struggles too hard to hold on to personal power may be labeled as non-compliant or combative. Secondly, in the flight response, anyone who emotionally withdraws or disengages too much can be also labeled as treatment resistant or uncooperative. And then third is the freeze response, which I sometimes refer to as the bobblehead response. This is somebody who gives in too easily to authority and can be labeled as either passive or unmotivated. And so many people that we have served or that we're currently serving have survived circumstances that we can hardly imagine. What we may label as pathological may be the very thing that has helped that individual to survive. So when we take a trauma-informed approach, we recognize that symptoms or problem behaviors are really adaptations to trauma, and that frequently including the feelings of helplessness or a loss of control that trauma also causes. And I think that this is really important. And in my work, we also look at different signs that a person may have a trauma response. And so some of those signs I've listed here, such as flashbacks or frequent nightmares, sensitivity to noises or even to touch, maybe expecting that something bad or something terrible is always going to happen, the other shoe is going to drop any minute, maybe not even remembering periods of one's own life, feeling numb or hardened, lack of attention and concentration, increased irritability, agitation, or excessive worry, anxiety, anger, feelings of shame or sadness. None of these signs are always associated with trauma, and each of these signs can be adaptations to changes that I had discussed earlier in terms of the fight, flight, or freeze response. But each of these types of behaviors can, in fact, play an important role in that person's life. It may even protect the person or help them to survive. By blocking out a very traumatic experience, by blocking out something that's happened in someone's lifetime, that can help preserve them in the here and now. And sometimes people block that out either by suppressing that memory or forgetting it altogether, or it can be blocked out by other things. So numbing oneself through drugs and alcohol or other types of behaviors. I want to share with you a model that I use a lot in my practice, and I use this pretty much across all types of settings and situations in which I am interacting with a person and having to understand where they are in their environment in this moment. So I want to share with you this model that is titled the Lawton's Environmental Press Theory. And the Lawton's environmental press theory is really a theoretical framework for understanding adaptation to one's environment, especially in older people. But I have used this theory to really guide how I interact with people and how I understand behavior, because behavior is communication. So when we are faced with somebody who is dysregulated or is having a trauma reaction or is in the midst of a crisis, it is our job to survey that environment and to survey that person's capacity to be in the environment. And we can do things to modify the environment in order to support them. So let me explain what you're looking at on your screen. So on the y-axis, I have written here capacity. And capacity essentially means your mental ability to be in this moment. What is your mental ability? What is that person's mental ability? And that ranges from low to high. On the x-axis, you see environmental press. Environmental press is another term to describe stimulation. I think of it also as stimulation. How much press is in the environment? What we want to do is find that zone of maximum functioning that all of us have. And anything outside of that can result in what we would call negative behavior. So for example, when a person's capacity is very high, but there's low stimulation, we may see negative behaviors come up. And the inverse is true. When capacity is really low and there's a lot of stimulation in the environment, then we also see negative behaviors. Let me give you a couple of examples that I think we can all relate to. So let's say it is Friday afternoon, and let's pretend that we're all back in our offices working. Some of us are still working in an office space, and some of us are at home. But let's just pretend this is pre-COVID, and it's 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, and you're working in, and you're all in different professions. I'll use my profession as an example, but it's 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, and I get a call from a distressed client. And this person is clearly in crisis. They want to leave their home. They're having maybe suicidal thoughts, and they're really needing an intervention right now. And so by the time I work on it, we get things kind of stabilized, we get supports in place, and then I have to do all my documentation. It's likely rolling around 6:30 by the time I'm heading out of the office. And this may have been you too. It always happens on a Friday afternoon, doesn't it? And you get a call from your significant other at home. Hey, what's for dinner? I've got nothing planned. Can you stop by the store? Okay, fine. You swing by the store, the place is crowded, there's two checkers, and you've either been this person or you have watched this unfold where somebody just loses it in a line, standing in a checkout line. There's 10 deep, there's screaming children, there's two checkers on a Friday evening. It's the end of a long week. You are tired. Your capacity is low. The press in the environment is extremely high. And you've seen people come unraveled in a line. They will say things like, God, can't you get more checkers on a Friday? Or they'll slam things. They might actually just ditch their cart. You may have been that person. Maybe I've been that person. But anyway, that's where capacity is low, environmental press is high, we're acting negatively. Now, the inverse could happen where let's pretend it's Friday morning, and I really love football. And back when we had Thursday night football, because of course we don't have that right now, but let's pretend that you were really good Thursday night. You did not take that extra glass of beer or wine. You got to bed early. You had a good night's sleep. You actually got up and exercised, had some breakfast, and you had to log on to a webinar at 9 a.m. You're feeling great. You're really on top of your game. You've answered emails. And let's say you log on to my webinar and I am droning on and on and on, and I'm reading from the slides like this, capacity on the y-axis, and you are just like, oh my gosh, this is not going to be my life for the next hour. Now, when we were attending these webinars in person, this is where people would really check out. They would start texting. They might actually pretend to take a call, gotta go. Lots of stuff happens in those situations. Might actually fall asleep during a presentation. So the difference here, and so in this case, your capacity is really high. The press is not enough. There's not enough stimulation to keep you intact, to keep you engaged, to keep you interested. What's interesting here is that the two examples that I've given you, we are all, for the most part, able to find a zone of maximum functioning. And we do that in a number of ways. If I'm at the grocery store, I might say something to myself like, look, this too will pass. You'll be home. There'll be a bottle of wine waiting for you. It's all going to be okay. I might just actually grab my phone and start looking, reading something. We have ways to kind of get through a difficult moment. On the other side, if I'm sitting in that webinar, I might actually have another cup of coffee. I might take copious notes, get myself kind of engaged, give myself some stimulation to be engaged for the next hour. We have ways of doing that. However, if we are working with somebody who might have a neurodegenerative disorder, such as dementia, who might have a delirium, who might have a traumatic brain injury, or are very dysregulated because they're having a traumatic response, or maybe they have had a stroke, any number of things that render them unable to engage in those coping mechanisms in the moment, then it is our responsibility to survey the environment, to survey their capacity. And we do that by watching the behavior, by noticing how they're reacting to us, how they're engaging with us. If they are slamming things down or pacing or shaking their legs, or maybe they start crying. These are all things that we can look at to kind of notice what's happening in the environment. So when I work with older adults, I try to make sure that there are limited distractions in the room. If there's a lot of caregivers or family in and out of a room, I may ask them to leave so that I can have one-on-one time with that person, ask the person to turn off their television, whatever that can be. I'm also aware that I am part of the environment. So perhaps I'm standing too close to that individual, or perhaps I am talking too fast. Maybe I need to slow down my speech. Maybe I need to stop talking altogether. These are things that we can do to manipulate that environment to make it more in that zone of maximum functioning. We want to talk about the trauma brain, because what happens is that when the brain senses danger, the thinking brain, the rational, the logical brain kind of shuts off, and then that person slips into an emotional brain. And sometimes a person can become, or their behavior can be very dysregulated. So what I want to kind of impart to you today are helping you develop skills that you can help clients regulate, become calmer and more connected. And so there are ways that you can be therapeutic without being a therapist. This is achieved very simply, actually, but these are skills that we don't always use. Can be achieved through warmth, through validation. And I'm going to go more into what validation means. Being flexible with a person, providing structure to a person, providing hope for the future. Maybe saying to a person, I see that you don't feel any hope right now and that you are feeling hopeless. So I'm going to hold the hope for you while we work this out, while things get on a different path. Maybe using humor. I bring a lot of humor into my practice because I think sometimes we need that in our lives, and people need to experience all the range of emotions, not just the sadness, not just the anger, but also to be connected to humor and joy. And then also helping people feel as if they are in a community. These are all things that you can do without being a therapist, but just being therapeutic in your approach. So each community, whether you community or a larger community, has a somewhat different network of services. But it's important to look for the services in any local context. And I've listed some of the services that are really important in working with older adults. Knowing who physicians in your community are knowledgeable about or comfortable in working and treating older adults, what various residents are available, are there geriatric care management services in your community? What are specialized services for older adults with dementia or for caregivers? For example, knowing who your local chapter is for the Alzheimer's Association is a really important resource. Maybe knowing if there are congregate meals in your community or home delivered meals such as Meals on Wheels or Angel Heart. Knowing what the senior rec and day centers are in your community, transportation, income assistance, all of these, and including mental health services, all of these are really important to know. And I will also say that I have found when you refer people to those services, they'll know that it's coming from another partner. It starts with us visiting those people. I will go to the senior center every now and again and just say hello. I will pick up their most recent calendar events and keep it in my office. Maybe serving on committees that different agencies that serve older adults and volunteering in some of those efforts. That can build a sense of community and also show that you are an active partner in that community as well. Because it does truly take a village. When working with older adults, it requires to view that person as a whole person and also requires community collaboration. You want to know who your virtual team is. So who can you call to help in any given circumstance that can offer support or maybe help remedy a problem? So I want to just continue talking about mental health services that are available to older adults. What we know is that generally therapy is oriented really towards increasing a client's independence or empowering that person to really solve their own problems. Therapists who specialize in working with older adults usually toggle between being a caseworker at times or a therapist. So an example that I've put here is the client might be referred to therapy because they're very depressed and so depressed that they haven't eaten in weeks. So the therapist might immediately refer them to a home delivered meal service before really starting in earnest therapy after a few days of having a good meal. So there are times where, especially around technology, I will tell you that sometimes my clients will come into therapy and one of the things that's causing them the most anxiety is they don't know how to work their phone or they can't get the printer to work. And sometimes I'm helping them troubleshoot a few things, just as this team has done so well with me over the last 5 minutes. So it's also important to know that when we talk about older adults and psychotherapy services, we want to bust a myth about that older adults are less likely to seek professional psychotherapy or counseling help than younger adults. That's just simply not true. And in fact, research has showed that older adults are not so much reluctant to use mental health services as they are unable to identify the problems as being psychological or simply unaware of what available mental health services exist. Other research has confirmed that older adults have more positive attitudes towards mental health professionals than did their younger cohorts, and that both young and older clients rated drug therapy as less credible and acceptable than that compared to psychological interventions. So we want to not buy into the myth that older adults just simply don't want help or have some stigma around mental health treatment. It's really just not the case. It's also important when we're talking about therapy services that I've been addressing what trauma-informed care is versus what is trauma-specific treatment. So trauma-informed care is not specifically designed to treat symptoms and syndromes related to trauma. It's really a philosophy of providing care that recognizes and takes into account the possibility of trauma in a client's history. Do we need to know what that trauma is? Do you need to know it? Not necessarily, but if we know that the prevalence of trauma is really high, just in general, across many sections of the lifespan. And we know that a person may have trauma in their past. And when we are intervening with a person or engaging with them, and they are showing us some behaviors that may be trauma induced, then we can approach them in a trauma-informed way. This is very different than trauma-specific treatment, where we used evidence-based practices, treatment models that have been proven to facilitate the recovery from trauma. And those trauma-specific treatments directly addresses the impact of trauma on an individual's life, and they're designed to treat the actual presence of or consequences of the trauma and the symptoms. So it's really important that you all know who those trauma-specific providers are in your area. So one resource that I would send you to is psychologytoday.com. If you go on to psychologytoday.com and you can enter in the area code or the city where you live, you can see the different specialties of therapists that are available in your area. And oftentimes those therapists will mention whether or not they treat trauma. It's a great resource, and I do highly recommend it. So I said before, you can be therapeutic without being a therapist. Building rapport is essential in working with older adults or responding to a crisis situation. You can develop skills to help de-escalate a dysregulated client while also communicating empathy. Here's 11 things. Why there's 11, I don't know. I thought of 11 and then I read about some others. But here's 11 things that I've come up that you never want to say to anyone that you're working with. Come here. You wouldn't understand because those are the rules. It's none of your business. What do you want me to do about it? Calm down. Calm down. Coincidentally, you probably never want to say to a woman either. Anyway, what's your problem? You never or you always. I'm not going to say this again. I'm doing this for your own good. Why don't you be reasonable? When you think about those statements, these are statements that you may have used with your own children or are using with children, but we wouldn't use this with a client or another adult with whom we're working. That's not going to build a relationship or build rapport or build trust. So we want to use statements that give reflection, communicate empathy, and validate. Verbally reflecting another person's emotional state. An example of that might be, it sounds like you feel very angry about this. Offering the ultimate empathic statement looks like, let me be sure what I heard is what you just said. When we check in with clients, when we ask to make sure that we have heard them correctly, it communicates to that person that we are with them and that we are actively listening to the problem that they are trying to tell us. Validating that person's emotions. You had to wait 3 days for me to return your call. Your question's really important, and I understand why you're mad about this. Being concise. When people are agitated, their ability to process verbal information is very compromised. And so we want to use short sentences and simple vocabulary. We want to give people the time to process what has been said to them, particularly in working with older adults. As we age, our processing speed naturally starts to slow down. And so we want to give people time to respond. We want to give them time to think about what's been told to them. We also want to slow down our speech. I noticed that and I'm aware of times where I may embed multiple questions into one sentence. For example, hi, Miss Smith, how are you doing today? Did you get a good night's sleep? How was your night of football? Okay, I've asked her 3 questions. She's on the first question and hasn't been able to even process the rest of that. So we want to be mindful of how we are presenting our language with older adults particularly, and also being concise in our language. Repetition can be essential. We have to persistently repeat the message until the person has heard that. And that can be very essential when we're either making a request, we're setting limits with a person, we're offering choices or alternatives. We want to combine repetition with other skills that we use, such as active listening or agreeing with an individual's position whenever possible. Identifying a person's wants and feelings, whether or not a request by somebody can be fulfilled or granted. It's important that all persons be asked what that request is. So I know we've got about 6 minutes, and we have 2 questions. So why don't I want to just go through, I'll just take maybe 2 more minutes here, and then I'll get to another question. I think active listening is another piece that we want to be mindful of. Leaning into a person's conversation as they're talking to you, using eye contact, nonverbal. I think it's also important that we recognize when we talk too much. Sometimes we just need to shut up for a while and let that person have time to tell their story. And I know for those of you who maybe work in the investigative sectors of either law enforcement or maybe adult protective services, you have a job to do. You have an assessment to do with that person. And so having that person tell their story can feel laborious sometimes, and you can feel rushed in your investigative process. So I would recommend that you allow a person at least 5 to 7 minutes to first talk to you about what's going on. Sometimes also people, when they're anxious, they to kind of relieve their anxiety a little bit. It serves as a way to maybe stabilize. It can also get a person ramped up as well. But when a person knows that you're listening and that you're being quiet for 5 minutes, that can communicate to them that you're engaged with them. Okay, so I'm going to have to pause. I do want to take 2 questions.
Okay, Sheri,
yeah.
you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so first question is, what advice would you give peer navigators when they are working with seniors with trauma issues as distinct from therapists?
Well, I think that these are the things that exactly I'm talking about now. The types of skills that you can use are kind of these basic listening and rapport building skills. Again, you can be therapeutic in your approach with a person without having to go into a therapy role with somebody. And when I've worked with peer navigators before, one of the things that's important is when a person starts talking about maybe specific things, they start saying things like, I feel hopeless about tomorrow. I feel like I'm completely helpless in this situation. It will never get better. You can offer to them the idea, or maybe just pose the question, have you ever talked to somebody? Would you be willing to talk to a counselor? It sounds like this is weighing heavy on your heart. It sounds like you have something to share. And this kind of goes outside of my role as your advocate or as a support person, but I know who you could call, or let me get a list for you of who you could call. Could I help facilitate that? And so I think that peer navigators are in a wonderful position to not only use those basic empathy skills, communication skills, active listening, building rapport, being kind of a stable support to that person, hearing what they have to say, but you can also hear when they need help and when it goes outside of your role. And if you're confused about that, I recommend that you connect with your supervisor to talk through that, and know kind of where your role stops and where another professional role could take over.
Okay, great. Let's see here. What techniques do you use to educate family members about the traumatized individual?
What techniques do I use to inform family members?
Yes, about the traumatized older adult.
So that gets real tricky because it depends if I have a release from the client in order to share information with their family. Sometimes the family knows that the individual has trauma in their background. For example, I worked with a person who her mother had Parkinson's disease and also had advanced stages of dementia from her Parkinson's. And she was also a Holocaust survivor. She was living in a skilled memory facility or community, and the staff noticed that she would become violent during bathing, particularly when they were turning on the shower. And they knew about her trauma history, but all they were focused on was her distress and her violence. And so I worked with the staff and I worked with the family in understanding that prior to her dementia, she was able to say in her brain, this is not the Holocaust. This is only a memory. I am safe here, and taking a shower, while that may be triggering, that's not going to send me over the edge. However, because she was in severe stages of dementia, her brain could not filter that, could not rationalize around that. And so she acted out behaviorally in ways where she aggressed towards staff. And so some of the ways that I worked with the family is having the family present during hygiene care, a trusted daughter that she felt very connected to, and also not doing showers, using sponge baths, using aromatherapy, using calm music. And so those are ways that we can work with family if we know a person's trauma history to say, here's what you're seeing. This is the behavior is specifically linked to that trauma. And what are the ways that we can help that person in a moment to provide care while recognizing that they're having a reaction that is trauma related?
Yes. Thank you, Sheri. Thank you so much, Dr. Gibson, today for being with us today. It looks like our time is up, and we did have a couple other questions. Please, you can send an email to elderjustice@us if you have any questions we were not able to get to today. And I want to thank everyone, especially Dr. Gibson and all of you, for your patience with technical problems. But I think it ended up resolving itself, and just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks to all of you. Keep doing the great work you do.